So when we're talking about these particular things, I don't want this to be too long when it comes to talking about this kind of thing, but it is really important, especially when we hone in a little bit more on influencers as a whole next week on chapters 2 and 3 of the Amanda Russell book. So when we talk about this, we've mentioned in the previous class about the importance of organizations and being able to have a team and be able to push advocacy when it comes to what it is about your specific brand. So branding not only works in terms of your internet presence on your website, but it also works in terms of your social media presence. I myself continuously ask the board of the nonprofit for geeks like us of, is this post okay? Now, thankfully, they've kind of given me full reign to do whatever I want, because it was something that they would sit there and go, no, whatever you're saying, it's all within the bounds of what we were to be talking about. So, and if there's anything that's difficult, we would let you know. But there are things about social media directors making flubs in terms of posting things they shouldn't have. In fact, John Oliver was really good about this in terms of talking about newsjacking gone wrong. Um, One of them was talking about how SpaghettiOs or tweeted something about their support in terms of the Never Forget idea for 9/11. And, John Oliver kind of slammed on SpaghettiOs to say, why do we need your opinion on this? This is something that it just doesn't matter per se. And again, newsjacking is about finding your way into the discussion, but also doing it in a way that fits. Not only fits the narrative for what's going on in the world, but also fits in the narrative when it comes to your particular brand and mission statement. So, there are different things that go on within these mission statements, and your social media needs to reflect that. So, for example, when it came into talking about Starbucks, for instance, this happened, I think, like 3 or 4 years ago. They did the Race Together campaign, which talked a lot about racial inequality worldwide, but more specifically, the campaign really took off in the United States. And predictably so, Starbucks, especially with their all white team of CEOs, got slammed pretty hard in social media for websites like Twitter for really, putting something that was kind of ill-advised. Even though what's interesting about it is, if you look at their mission statement, it wasn't out of the narrative that they put in. The CEO was very adamant, and I'm forgetting his name. The CEO was always really adamant about, we're going to do stuff that people don't like, and we're going to do stuff that is going to push the boundaries of the narrative that people might be uncomfortable with. It shouldn't be something that's uncomfortable. However, it was a it was something that was extremely risky in terms of their brand, and a lot of people didn't like it. But it was within their mission statement, and advertising agencies have that too, where they're like, to some extent, we're here to piss people off, because we're here to get attention one way or the other. So, and it is difficult when we talk about things like corporate social responsibility and cause marketing. Brands like Ben and Jerry's, for instance, have always been really known for good employee relationships. But less known ones are like something like Walmart, for instance. When anybody sees like an environmental advocacy pitch from Walmart, people automatically get upset because they're like, you're one of the biggest chains in this country, and we don't feel like your message is appropriated to do something like that. However, if you look at their spending, Walmart is one of the biggest spenders for environmental advocacy over any government organization. So, there are always things to be thinking about in terms of what those mission statements are. But there is that kind of preachy, is there too much CSR going on? Why the hell should you care about this, and so forth. But we do need kind of a background in terms of how social media directing works. So things like having your mission statement whatever it may be. And this will work for influencers as well. You don't have to have one that's like specified, but again, identifying who you are and what your brand is goes a very long way. So that's something you should be thinking about. Your organizational structure is one to be considered. I think I've mentioned this before. There's a book called Spider and the Starfish that talks about organizational communication, and more specifically, centralized versus decentralized organizations. In this case, more specifically, do you have a hierarchy of people that run your organization, or do you have different business practices that goes against that traditional hierarchy? And that really does kind of come into play about how your social media will work. If you've got someone that you have to run by the head of your organization before you post anything, these are the kind of things that we have to be thinking about. However, when we get into talking about like decentralized, so, you could be talking about any web organization when it comes to like things like, well, I say music pirating sites, that's very decentralized in terms of that in particular industry. If one goes down, two more will pop up. I mean, that was kind of the idea of the starfish, is if you cut off a limb, one will just grow right back. And that's kind of how the decentralized structure works in this particular instance, and why it's so important that we have things like that. But if you look at, breweries have this a lot where, for example, Fat Tire is completely employee owned, and they kind of revel in that kind of discourse when it comes into not only their social media, but their mission statement as well, to where it's just not just one person doing things. It's everybody kind of coming together when it comes to that decentralized component. So again, we've got mission statements, we've got organizational structure that revolves around, is it centralized or decentralized? And then you've got key players. When you look into advertising structure, and you may have gotten some of this if you've taken classes from Roger Gantz or Laura Britton or Tom Mueller, etc., you might have kind of gotten into where you might lie when it comes into like an advertising degree, whether it be like business or creative emphasis. But there's a lot going on there, which is, if you look at any kind of media guide for an organization, especially media organizations, they'll give you kind of a handful of information of what people do within their advertising, whether it be I'm a creative director, or I'm an art director, or I'm a copywriter within that realm of creative, or I do media sales or media planning when it comes to, a media related field, or something like accounts director, that kind of thing for accounts. These are all roles of what we might have. So you've got things like leaders or word artisans, creative gurus, analysts, social designers that deal specifically with social media in general. And we're going to be talking about that quite often. We have to come up with our businesses that our social media very might well have their own mission statement and their own SWOT analysis, etc., for doing things differently that you would normally do versus like traditional media. So that's super important when it comes to the grand scheme of things in social media. There's also things in terms of the procedures that we look at and social landscape. So with procedures, you have things like your mission statement. You have things like your employee handbook, which is how your employees are supposed to treat customers. An easy example to talk about is the discourse from Chick-fil-A. And there's actually been a lot of really funny memes that go along with it, of several people saying, like, here, you work at Chick-fil-A now, and somebody says, here's your food, thank you. And it's like, you're welcome. And somebody gets like really upset. And he's like, you're welcome. Is this Popeyes? Excuse me? No, you say, my pleasure, which oddly enough was stole by the Ritz-Carlton. That was actually their saying to start off with. But I mean, things like airlines DMing people when there's like a flight delay or a flight cancellation on Twitter. I've experimented with that from time to time, even when I had a very small following. If something went wrong, even with 50 some odd followers that I had at the time, I tweeted out to Delta or United or American and say, hey, my flight, isn't going off. And for some reason that I thought was kind of ridiculous, I was playing into it a little bit. But quickly, the airlines contacted me back and said, hey, DM us, talk to us, and that is one of the things that comes up. Worked at Chick-fil-A for the past 4 years and accidentally said my pleasure. Oh gosh, that's got to be rough. But there are other things that go in with these media plans. Like for instance, we go into like brand guides. So think about like RGB color schemes. If y'all aren't familiar with it, it's kind of these color palettes. We worked with the National Student Advertising Competition with Coca-Cola one year, and their RGB is very specific to the point where if you click on a Coke can at any point with an eyedropper tool on something like Photoshop, you can get different variations of the RGB scale when you click on something, and they're very adamant to say, no, that was not our RGB, and they'll give you very specific numbers. So things like color give you a very specific personality. And it's important to realize that, especially when it comes for like universities, for instance. One of the ones that comes up to my mind, at least, is my alma mater at Virginia Tech. If you call our colors any shade of purple, for instance, or just say that our colors are orange, people will be very matter of fact to correct you. No, it's burnt orange and Chicago maroon. And you might say that's kind of petty, but I mean, we come from a university that if anybody says Appalachian State, that drives us up the wall. So again, that's very important to the branding of anything when it comes into procedures. Other things might be like crisis response plans. So from stakeholders, activists, people who just love to complain about certain things, AKA me with my airline experience. And it's the kind of thing that having a strategy in mind, in place, goes a long way. So if you ever take a crisis communication class, it's very important to note to have a crisis plan in any given circumstance of like, what are the most common problems within your business? So, currently, as again, an NDSU alumni, my boy Carson Wentz is under a lot of fire for the Eagles and here in Fargo for, I think he's playing fine. I just think the Eagles are terrible. And is that entire division. Might get a few looks for that, but at the same time, I don't think he's amazing, but I do think there's a lot of people that might see differently. Yeah, I'm seeing that. Then comes market research. Okay, so when we've talked about diffusion before, diffusion of innovation, but one thing we haven't talked about a lot is how do we get in a mindset of analyzing what starts a diffusion? So we talk a lot about innovators, and innovators within the diffusion are often, and these are oddly enough, your influencers, are often kind of gawked at and laughed at because they're doing stuff that you would say, why would anybody be engaging in this? Why is anybody super interested in this? Why is it that Among Us, for instance, the game took off now, that's been out for a couple of years? Why is it right now that this happens? And market researchers are usually pretty good about this. And as much as, okay, I have a beef with this, as much as they have this really cool system of analyzing what is kind of popular or what could be a new trend, I hate their name as a job. They're called cool hunters. And yes, that's what they're called. I can't stand that. For like one of the coolest jobs you could ever have, having the least cool name seems kind of ironic. But where are these targets emerging? You'll soon discover that it's hard to ride that wave of early adopters, especially if you are an innovator. This is why I talk when we talk about like things like leadership. the second person who joins is just as important as the leader who started the movement in the first place, because it increases validity. And so when you've got things like influencers being a strong advocate for your brand, it takes a lot of other people to really hone in and say, I believe in this too. There was a case study in the Amanda Russell book that I really liked, that was talking about some health influencer mentioning how she was drinking this protein shake that tasted like chalk. And her followers picked up on it immediately, saying that this is inauthentic, this is not you. I'm unfollowing because you do not seem like your honest self with that. And she was like, it was humbling and it was accurate, because people could see right through the inauthentic way of the fact that I was just like, this is trash. This is not a very good product in terms of what I'm drinking in this case. So you know who you are and you know what you like, but also it needs to be considered, for instance, that influencers have their own mission statement as well. That the market research has to indicate that not only your brand is important, but theirs is too. So that always has to be talked about. And then is the SEO, search engine optimization. We talk a lot about hashtags, for instance, and keywords. With Google, they have a thing called spider bots that go over your website, for instance, and kind of look over some of the keywords that you use consistently within the discourse of what you're using. And by the way, this is an important thing. I've had students in the past that got mad at me for one reason or another about grammatical issues and saying, it's unfortunate that you grade so harshly on grammar when it comes to major papers. And I said, well, one of the reasons is that if you look at Google spider bots, they actually take into account for misspellings and grammatical errors, and you can be skipped over on SEO when it comes to your particular brand. So y'all check your spelling, because it actually means a lot when it comes to your particular brand showing up at the top of a Google list. And that is something that cannot be overstated here. Other things, the other areas. So we talked a little bit about the procedures. Let's talk a little bit about the social landscape. One are key listening phrases. This has to do a lot with, this has to do with a lot of SEO in general. So for example, although she hasn't worked on it in quite a while, my wife has an Etsy shop that she does clay miniatures. And we have done a lot of work to help her brand and increase what it is about how she creates these things, and how she can better put herself in an SEO perspective within Etsy in general. And so, one thing that I mentioned, it's like, it's not just clay that she's working on with her crafty projects, it's clay miniatures. And being careful in terms of what is considered through copyright infringement and so forth, which is something that a lot of people don't think about. But these are the kind of things of not only using hashtags appropriately and keywords appropriately, but cycling them too, especially for things like Instagram. If you spam hashtags throughout, you can get what is called shadow banned, which if you're not familiar with this term, ultimately means that you could lose the unique following up to, I think it's 2/3 of your follow. It usually isn't any effect if you're like a nano influencer, but if you're a mega influencer and you're spamming the hashtags over and over and over again, that's something where that can be a colossal issue, as 2/3 of your audience might not see your content on a regular basis. So people have wised up to that quite a lot as influencers. And one of the things that they often do is they actually rotate their hashtags and rotate their content from daily posting. So shadow banning, although it's not talked about a lot now, it's still very much into the conversation. So again, key listening phrases goes well. Other things like conversation platforms, where are things happening? I jokingly say my research takes me to a lot of weird places on the internet. And we've mentioned this from time to time of like, what are some of the sites that you frequent based on the content that you're delivering. So again, for me doing as a lore stream, Reddit is a very strong place for me to go to talk about this. As for my research, when it comes to a book we're writing about anime, going on Tumblr actually goes into a long stretch of talking about my particular discourse when it comes to this particular topic. Yeah, and so again, sites like Reddit, you might not think of it right off the bat, but it is important in these certain circumstances. And even things like, granted, it hasn't been in conversation much, but like 4chan, which I don't recommend anybody going on 4chan. It's probably some of the most horrific language you've ever read in your life. But there are also things like branding within kind of communication dialogue. How does your brand communicate in this kind of instance? I actually have a colleague of mine who I adore, but we give him a hard time because of his branding that he does when it comes to doing panels. Is it seems so inauthentic. I know he means well, but anytime we're on a panel for something in front of a live audience at PAX, he'll go, we like to have fun here. And my other buddies and I kind of give him a hard time about that. I'm like, you don't have to just outright say it, okay? The fact that we're having fun on stage just can be it by itself. We don't have to, you don't have to celebrate it, in other words. There are other things to go into, and I'm going to post this up on the, let's see, I'll put this up on As You Learn, in terms of analyzing your strength of communication through things like what are called edge ranks, which posting a formula for it, it looks a lot more daunting than it actually is, in terms of showing sigma equals UWD, and this is a multiplier for how you can analyze your social media messaging here. And so things like affinity that you'll see here. So affinity is one thing, is score between the connection and the user, which means things like positive clicks per social media connection. And actually Black Mirror does a really good episode on this. So if you've ever watched Black Mirror before, there's the one where they rate the stars based on any kind of interaction you have. I think it's like one of their first episodes, but it was super cool. And it was a really good instance for talking about how we, rate things nowadays. So that's kind of like an affinity of your valence, if you will. The other is weight, and this is one of the reasons why Facebook was really intuitive by creating different emoticons to rate things, whether you like something or love something, or give it a haha or a wow, or now it's care or angry. Those things matter, and especially when it comes to social media direction, to where it's going to sound really stupid here, but my social identity to like a post versus love something, that little extra time it takes to do something actually means something. So it is something to think about. The last thing, and the D of the sigma equals UWD, is decay. This is one that almost nobody talks about, is when does your post come up versus when does it, when do people see it and react? There might be some things where, the comments that come in are, this did not age well, for instance. You could probably have a bunch of examples that go along with that. But the decay, again, is that measurement between content creation and the individual seeing it. The last thing I want to mention before, bringing this out into discussion, is the idea of influencers and social media influencers. And the Russell book talks a lot about these major benefits, things that we haven't covered so far that I just want to talk about briefly, is a couple things. One is benefiting off of somebody else's trust. As a brand, it's hard to get new clients that are very interested in your material. So it's really important to have the trust of an influencer and their audience to be that brand recommendation. That being said, it's as equally detrimental that the person that is the influencer is being honest about it. Because if they're not, then again, you've got a problem twofold. It's not only something where your brand is seen as inauthentic, but at the same time, you're losing a stretch of audience of people that might trust that person and hurt that social media influencer's business as well. So you might have lost twofold on that one. There are new niches that you might explore. Another hard component as an advertiser is really focusing on niches that you have no audience in. When we do National Student Advertising Competition, one of the first things that comes up is that they will say our brand is dying or it's hurting. And one of the reasons is we don't have the age demographic that we want, which, in this case is like Gen Zers are millennials. So we did an SAC competition on Snapple, and they're like, we just don't see the same audience that we once had with Snapple that we had in the 90s. Because if you look at a lot of 90s televisions with The Sopranos and Sex and the City, Snapple was everywhere, and they did that very strategically. And so, again, how do you do that? Well, you try to find people that can be a niche that would fit your brand really well. So that's why, like, if you go on Twitch, you'll see brands like Miller Lite and Subway taking over. They kind of find their way in terms of trying to create fit. The other thing is immediate and long-term value of social media influencers. I usually talk about more the immediate side, but there is something to be said if you get a good contract with a influencer and it's one that it's somebody you can trust and they won't say anything that's completely detrimental, which is what all brands say, is like, I'm just afraid that this influencer is just going to put their foot in their mouth and say something ridiculously dumb, and that's ultimately what's going to be the fall of my business. But again, if you find someone that you really like and give them a long-term contract, it can go a long way. It gives you multi-channel exposure, and it also has it eliminates the burden of content creation that you normally have to think about. If somebody else is doing it for you, you don't have to think about it as much, and it might be in platforms you didn't think about. So, you might not have a TikTok budget, for instance. You might not have a budget by creating filters in Snapchat. That just may not be on your radar. But the influencer that you have a contract with does, and they can use that. And if you kind of give them that freedom of creation, it can go a long way. And then it's content you can reuse as well. I think a lot of people do this in terms of either Throwback Thursdays, or they do it in senses of talking about posts they've done in the immediate past as well, that they can create even something as simple as retweets of talking about their information. And it gives you bragging rights. I think Amanda Russell's page of talking about how Karlie Kloss was wearing our brand's yoga pants, for instance, and that you can use it to say, hey, she's using our brand, and that's pretty damn cool. So these are the kind of things that we talk about on influencers, and talking about how this works again